Well, thank you. Welcome to the GenZ and Open Fabric for Future Data Processing Needs session. This session is indeed an extension of the session just prior about the Open Fabric Management Architecture, where we introduced the requirements of and a sort of a framework for a universal fabric manager. In this session, we're going to outline where the strengths of GenZ Fabric and the management architecture set out in the GenZ Fabric Management Architecture specification dovetail well with the envisioned model of the UFM. Next slide, please. We won't really spend much time on any GenZ details. There's plenty of other things, other places to go to learn about GenZ in detail. We have a couple of key things we want to pass along, and then we'll wade into reasons why GenZ is a great choice to be the first provider implemented under the UFM. So next slide, please. So since there's no real way to cover a deep background on GenZ in 30 minutes, just going to point out that whether you know nothing about GenZ or if you know GenZ fairly well, you can still find a lot of additional information on the Consortium's website. Their current specifications are there, several training articles, presentations, white papers. One important item is the preliminary draft of the GenZ Fabric Management Specification. I think what's out there is Rev 0.7. We are proposing 1.0 for general release, but it's not public yet, which documents a lot of the details about the general management architecture for managing a GenZ composable fabric. We're going to talk about this stuff shortly, but first we got an important milestone to mention to people. So next slide, please. And maybe an answer to everyone's favorite GenZ question when we talk about GenZ, when can I get one? Well, Smart Modular has a GenZ micro development kit available now. The micro development kit contains an ARM-based Linux host which can do loads and stores to a GenZ memory module through the bridge that's built into the ARM card. It's in the form of an FPGA. And it can do loads and stores to a Z memory module or ZMM. Now the ZMM is not shown in this picture, but there's room for 3 of them in that bay off to the left with the door. When the door is open, you can load the ZMMs. And when you close the door, the fans keep the ZMMs cool. Next slide, please. It's a small, simple platform that allows development of GenZ in-band management software, device drivers, and computing applications that want to use disaggregated memory. It's not a ton of memory. It's not the fastest thing you're ever going to see, but you can get your feet wet and you can start writing code. Next slide, please. So it's available for development only, obviously. You can use this listed email to request details and discuss availability and get quotes. So now we're going to move on to a little bit about GenZ itself. So next slide, please. So what is GenZ? Obviously, we're not going to answer a whole lot about that today. But if you know nothing about GenZ, here are the most important things to understand for today. First and foremost, it's a multi-host memory semantic fabric that was architected to be the major interconnect among composable shared multi-tenant resources. So it can tie hyper-converged platforms together. It can compose disaggregate resources into virtual platforms. It can expand simple compute nodes with additional memory or additional storage, networking, or accelerators. It can make those things private or shared because they're located on the fabric. And it can connect these things in any topology. You can use mesh topology, you can use star topology, you can use a ring or daisy chain topology. It's very, very flexible. Next Next slide, please. Secondly, it's based on large-scale fabric requirements, such as congestion management, so that you can have reasonably predictable quality of service on a large fabric. It has end-to-end retry for reliable hardware transport, so that you can use memory semantic load store transactions across the fabric. They don't get lost. The hardware will retry them. They don't get dropped. Multiple hardware managers for scaling, such that you can have a reasonable workload for each of your managers, so that you can monitor your metrics, et cetera, et cetera. And it has standards for interoperability of the hardware and the software. It's designed to scale from a single enclosure to an entire data center. Next slide, please. And it enables composition of total solutions. And I've called it a composable fabric. What do we mean by composition or composable? Well, it's intended to be the backbone fabric for runtime composable systems, which means it allows the solution providers to combine disaggregated resources to create systems that are optimized to run a specific application. You compose what you need when you need it, and when you're done with it, you reassign it. It sets the bar very high for flexibility, and so it needs a tool stack that will deliver this broad feature set to the end user. There's a lot of knobs to dial around. So we need to go back to the Universal Fabric Manager story we were discussing in the previous session and discuss how the GenZ Fabric Management System relates. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So we spent last session developing this take on the right of a universal fabric management stack for a fabric with composable resources. Here's a quick recap. Again, we see the client or end user of the fabric resources and their view of the stack, which is limited to just the apps they're interacting with and paying for. Next slide, please. And then we have the solution provider and their view. And as we stated last time, the solution provider really wants to just deal with high-level automation tools. These tools are just applications for solution providers, and these tools need to deal with a standardized universal fabric manager framework and interface so that the solution provider does not see the fabric details. Next slide, please. So now we have a fabric admin in their view, which is all about the interface of their fabric manager stack over here on the lower right with the upper layer tools through that framework in red. The implementation of the fabric specific controls that realize the functionality offered by the northbound interface is what the fabric admin wants to concentrate on. And then the common functions of the UFM are implemented for specific fabrics via a fabric provider. That's the proposal we made in the last session. We also noted that the common functions that are required of the fabric management portion of a composable execution environment. So we propose the following collaboration-driven universal fabric manager. Next slide, please. So this provides that interface, which represents a standardized model of a fabric to the application layers above it. So it interfaces with clients via Redfish. That's the proposal. It provides methods that enable clients to dynamically bind resources into functional systems and configure them. And it enables fabric-specific providers to program to a common set of features as a result. So all your different fabrics over here on the right have a provider that supplies these necessary functions in whatever manner is required. If you already have standardized ways of doing things for your specific fabric, you would just call on those things. You would have a simple provider that just translates from the Redfish request coming in up top to the standard management tool stack call coming out the bottom and going to your hardware. And in the case of GenZ, we have our list. So next slide, please. The common functionality, as we mentioned last time, most any fabric provider needs to support crawling the fabric, discovering the resources, tracking them in some form of database, publishing that inventory to clients, giving them a model so that they can manipulate the objects in the inventory, servicing the client requests to configure resources, and then meeting requests to configure the fabric itself, which is something that we would love to automate. Enable and disable access, map or unmap resources to or from the fabric, create appropriate routes with the appropriate quality of service with simple calls that the orchestration tools know they want point A to talk to point B. They want this much bandwidth. They want these protections. They don't really care about routing restrictions or setting up keys or any of those details. That's all done in the provider. Now, how does this architecture relate to the GenZ fabric management architecture? Next slide. So it actually relates very well. On the right, there's a slightly modified GenZ management stack. Basically, I've reverted some of the terminology to what we've been using today, but the stack looks the same. Very early on, we established the relationship between a classic tool stack layers on the right and the roles that were fulfilled by the GenZ management environment on the left. So taking a look at the roles on the left, the first thing is the applications and orchestration layers. The GenZ fabric management specification does not deal with those layers or the automation or orchestration tools. These layers define the environment to be provided by the fabric. They don't define the fabric or much about the fabric, and those tools try to hide the fabric from the developers, so we don't deal with them. The highest level that needs to explicitly control fabric components is the composability manager. So this is the layer that has visibility of all the logical resources that can be assigned. If it's on the fabric and it's available to be assigned someplace, the composability manager has to know about it. It's the keeper of the grand plan on what the fabric and all its resources and all its fabric managers are trying to accomplish. And it's the keeper of authorized connections. It's the entity that knows that server A can never talk to server B's storage out there on the fabric. And it's all represented via Redfish fabric objects. That was from day one almost. Next are the resource managers that control the pools of shared resources. And these are the managers that include classic things like storage managers, image managers, software-defined networking managers, etc. And then there's some new ones, fabric-attached memory managers, storage class memory managers, certain types of security managers, keeping things safe and secure. So these two layers map the user needs expressed by the upper layers to resources available on the fabric. But these managers do not directly manipulate GenZ fabric components. They don't have access to the actual hardware. So they have to call into the fabric manager interface and request changes. And the fabric management specification does not dictate, our fabric management specification does not dictate how these upper layers implement these upper roles, but it does outline the requirements that Redfish is the standard interface for these upper layers to use to converse with the fabric managers. So by now that should sound very familiar, just as the diagram looks very familiar. Next slide, please. So continuing on with the GenZ management stack. Below the composability manager and the resource manager roles in the GenZ management stack are the fabric manager and hardware prep roles. The fabric manager is the only manager that can make dynamic changes to the fabric resources in a GenZ system anyway. Hardware prep is just a set of boot configuration requirements. We're not going to deal with this layer anymore. We're going to concentrate on the fabric management layer. That's where the real work of controlling the physical devices of the fabric and its endpoints is done. So the GenZ fabric management specification is focused on the fabric manager role and the services it provides. It's all architected around a Redfish northbound interface to converse with the higher level managers. And it's responsible for the typical fabric management actions such as discovery and enumeration, programming the actual route tables, configuring address mappers, and it communicates with other managers using Redfish objects whenever possible. So again, that should sound familiar. So just by comparing this description of the GenZ Fabric Manager, we came to the conclusion that since the GenZ Fabric Management specification defines the requirements and policies that need to be implemented by the GenZ Fabric Manager, and they're the same as what we defined for the Universal Fabric Manager framework and the Fabric Provider plugin. Next slide, please. We think the GenZ Fabric Management specification is a pretty good blueprint to start with for a UFM provider. That's why our recommendation to use GenZ as the first fabric provider is there. So this proposal is right in line with GenZ's strategy. Next slide, please. Which from the beginning has been to work with industry standard bodies to build relationships which support a standardized end-to-end approach to networking and connecting multiple resources together. GenZ has ongoing work registers and memos of understanding with the DMTF to extend Redfish fabric models to support the GenZ fabric. That's over there on the upper right. An MOU with OFA to create the much needed universal fabric manager and accompanying GenZ fabric manager provider. That's here on the left. And then with CXL to define bridging between the two protocols so that you have a way to get to the GenZ fabric. Next slide, please. So what to do next? So express your opinion about the UFM at the Birds of a Feather session later today. Weigh in on how you think this argument is holding up. Review the GenZ Fabric Management spec and consider its ramifications to your business. Provide feedback to make it better, make it what it needs to be for you. Take a look at the GenZ Micro Development Kit. How might it serve you? And of course, most importantly, support the formation of the Universal Fabric Manager work group and contribute time and resources to make the UFM a reality. Next slide, please. Thank you. We actually ended up with a lot of time left. I am surprised.
We do have a few questions. So.
I'm sure we do.
All right. So the first one is from Sudhindra Sampath. Do you need to install GenZ specific drivers on all the resources that will be part of the compostable architecture?
Well, you would need GenZ specific drivers for GenZ specific devices. You shouldn't need GenZ devices if you're not using a GenZ fabric, and you wouldn't need GenZ device drivers for that. It depends on how common the call that you're making is, if it's something that has to be a fabric specific provider, there's probably a device driver associated with it.
Okay, so does that answer your question? Your mic is open, by the way, in case you want to participate verbally.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you very much. So my question there was, in one of your slides, you had a traditional server and an accelerator and all those systems, which basically are exposed through the GenZ fabric as a composable device, which will be exported to some application. So my question there is, for all this traditional server, do you have to install a specific driver that the fabric can discover that? So that was my question, actually. So I think I understood what you said. Thank you very much.
Okay.
There was also a follow-up. How will the GenZ fabric discover the resources that are part of the composable infrastructure?
Well, like every fabric, there is architecture that defines a discovery process. For GenZ, if you are using in-band management, GenZ discovery is based upon when a link comes up and auto trains, then the component on the other end of the link flags its manager and alerts it that there is a new player in the game, and there is a new entity out on the fabric. And so the fabric manager would come in to the near end of the link. We call it a boundary link. And it would query the component on the other end. So it's very much like, I think, Ethernet. When a link goes active, you can determine that there's something out there and you can go talk to it. And so it's all architected that way. Our management spec gives an overview of how that works. The core spec has the actual detailed requirements to design components to make that work. It's not as easy to follow as sometimes you would like. But it's in the two specs. The management spec would probably explain it as well as anything quickly.
Okay, thank you, Russ. Other questions? Okay, Russ, I do know how to find you. In case there are questions, I'll reach out to you offline and make sure I get the response to the attendees asking. Thank you for your time today. I guess we will talk to you again during the Birds of the Feather later today.
Yep, I will see you then.